Great. Well, thank you all. I'm sure there's some questions in the audience, and while you all come up to the mics, I'll start off. And one of my first questions, Mike, is for you, just kind of following up on your comments about the trends in the data that you're seeing in Washington. And it sounds really promising on many levels there. I'm not as familiar with your reporting system. I'm more familiar with what Maryland does, and Maryland has a form that has to be filled out. And I use the word has to because there are different interpretations of what it means to fill out the form and document it. And I've been at meetings with district representatives, some that are doing really great work around prevention, and they'll say, oh, we only have to fill out the form if this situation isn't handled effectively. And others will interpret it of, oh, anytime I see bullying, I fill that out. Or I only do it when they're actually suspended. So there's some implementation issues. And I think one challenge in those systems is they're pretty punishing, because when you submit the form, that number kind of gets chalked up against you. So sometimes the implementation of the policy can be rather punishing. In one of our districts in Maryland, when they first rolled out this policy and they summarized all the data, and it's public knowledge, so it was Frederick County, one of our very strong school districts. But they had a really aggressive team that got out there and made that policy available. But they ended up in the newspaper. The caption actually said, "Black eye on Frederick County for high rates of bullying." But in reality, they were probably just the ones that implemented it most extensively. One of our other districts that was a more urban district forgot to implement it, and they had 0 rates. And so, you get very different implementation when you're just looking at those bottom lines. So I wonder, from your perspective, how do you all treat those data, and how does it map on to some of the other data sources that we have?
How much time do I have? No, it's an interesting, the whole process is an interesting process here. I'm going to go back to our legislation and what we're mandated to do. Washington is a local control state, so every school district writes its own policies and procedures. There are guidance policies and procedures provided by our school board association. We work in collaboration with them quite a bit. There's an unusual situation that arose around HIB, harassment, intimidation, and bullying, in that, let's see, it was like 3-4 years ago now, the legislation mandated that OSPI and several stakeholders, so we had stakeholders from literally all across the state and all different kinds of representation, that we write the model policy and the model procedures, and every school district is mandated to adopt that policy and those procedures. The only changes they could make is if they strengthened them in some way or other. Another piece of the legislation, and I'm saying that in preparation for the answer, the other piece of the legislation says that each school district will have what we call in Washington a compliance officer, who is that person who is kind of like a Jenny function within that school district. That person's responsibility is to receive all the incident reports and all the investigation reports of harassment, intimidation, and bullying that go on within his or her district. It stops there. And we were having these conversations earlier this morning. What we would love to be able to do is to collect the same kinds of things, because the compliance officers have that, but there's no collection mechanism, there's no collection requirement. So if we could do that, we would get a lot more information on the kinds of things we really want to find out about. They're also required to report on programs and training and so forth. We have a drop-down menu, a click-off list of things that are available. We have no idea how much fidelity goes into some of those implementations, so we'd love to have that data as well.
And I think that highlights the connection to the last panel about fidelity of implementation of policies and adaptations. Some may be appropriate, some may not. For that context, we know very little about policy implementation as it relates to bullying prevention and its impact. So I think we'll move to Deb in the audience here for a question.
Hi, so Deb Temkin from RFK Center again. One of the things that I'm hearing from your discussion is that, one, the lack of definition, even from Washington State to Maryland, that's represented on this panel, is problematic. So although the CDC released its uniform definition, that probably is not necessarily helpful, because the policies and laws in your states are what they are. And I also heard Mr. Dolan mention reporting of bullying. In full disclosure, I spent 3 years at the federal government, and I don't recall that there was a bullying reporting system unless you were a grantee or if it was a harassment data.
No, this is the behavior and weapons reporting processes.
Okay. So I'm wondering, I know there are, I think, 3 bills currently pending in Congress to try to add bullying to federal legislation, to add it to ESEA, among other bills. Whether or not those are the right bills, do you think that adding some sort of definition and emphasis in federal legislation might be helpful for you at the school level to help unify resources, unify funding, et cetera?
Well, in our district, we have a definition. We have a code of conduct. We have a progressive set of discipline. We have what looks pretty ideal, but the problem still remains about perception and, more defining, and then the fear of retaliation. So it gets coded as, okay, this looks like bullying, but maybe it's a aggressive, fight, or maybe it's a disrespect. And so, not that schools are, I'm not accusing schools of doing this, but it's a concern. It raises my concern, it raises all of our concerns. And Will, you can speak at your schoolhouse too.
If you have a clearly defined definition of what it is at your school, I like the one conversation about upscaling this, because taking it from a school, a pilot program, to a countywide adopted program is difficult sometimes. Not all schools across the county have the same level of problems with this, but it is an issue that should be addressed everywhere. So having a common definition that jurisdictions across the country can say, this is the basis of what we do, I think is valuable. That creates a starting line for everybody to begin with. As far as the fidelity of implementation, of course, kudos to Catherine and everything she's been able to do for us, particularly at my school. I'm kind of an anomaly because I have the benefit of having been able to travel to do some presentations, to hear speakers around the country. And actually, we had an international conference, didn't leave the United States, but the other people came to us. And you get a picture that this is a problem everywhere. And there are programs that help resolve the issues or address the problems. We have a deputy superintendent that says what gets checked gets done. So we're always under the microscope as far as our numbers and how we're doing with the programs that we've implemented. One thing I have to be is very transparent with my community, with my parents, and certainly with the faculty, and we share the data that we collect. So it's no mystery of what's happening in our building, and I think that's a model that should flow throughout the county, because as we are more aware of where the issues lie, we can address them. Dig down to root causes and then try to do the intervention strategies that will address them.
There's also a disconnect that we see at times between the parent and the parent's understanding and definition of bullying and what we understand to be bullying. And of course, it's we have to blend the two, but we have either parents disagreeing and invalidating the whole concern, or we have just the opposite. So when we're dealing with a broad range of folks, so I think that how we marketed this, how we define it, how we market it is very important. And what we saw from the data, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, this to me was just huge, that the kids were seeing and saying there was far more bullying going on across we have 120 schools, and we used, nine of our high schools to participate in this. Nine schools, and the parents, the staff's rate of recognizing bullying was very, very low. So again, there's real work to be done around that.
I think we'll take these last two questions, and I'll do your trick where we can bundle them both together. So if we wouldn't mind saying both of the last questions, and then we'll have our panel respond to them.
Mine is hopefully a quick one. So I'm curious, before you even consider taking a program on, to implement any kind of prevention program. How do you see your role in social engineering your schools and your classrooms in light of the research, for example, that we heard about this morning regarding deviance in the peer groups?
And my question is both from a research and a sort of incident response and prevention, but in terms of both aspects. I haven't heard anything in the 2 days that we've been talking about with respect to privacy. So can you speak to how privacy...
I had a question about that maybe we should have discussed more, is that there are some inhibitors for sharing of information between agencies because of legal guidelines and what have you. And the more that perhaps we could work on breaking through some of those guidelines or inhibitors, people become more aware at the various levels that need to be addressing these concerns. I wanted to talk about building the culture in a school a little bit because that's extremely important. And my school, I will say I thought it was a very good school before we ever started Maryland Safe and Supportive School Initiative and looking at bullying prevention. But I also recognized that there was a need for some change because of just the culture of the school. It wasn't exactly where I wanted to be. So we found our foundation was building the relationship first and building a culture within the school of acceptance. And that took a year of working with parents, students, and teachers and devotion of an immense amount of time to do that. But if I joked with the team here, I said, if I had a moment, we'd do a team building exercise. I'd ask you all to stand up. You'd go find somebody you don't know. I'd give you 3 questions to ask that person, and then you come back and you report. And I would say, well, let's say, I know Mike is from Washington State, or in that kind of thing. Well, what happens is when you do that, all of a sudden in the classroom, it's starting to extend from classroom to a small community. And the people in that classroom actually have a connection. You know who they are, and you know something about them. You know, I could ask you to build a little cube and put certain personal preferences and likes and dislikes on that cube. And then I could walk around as we were talking in groups or if we did any kind of dialogue and look at your cube and know something about you. And I'm creating community in a classroom. That's just the small steps, lowest hanging fruit, what you can do anywhere. And then that needs to be expanded to a school-wide list of expectations that are agreed upon by all the stakeholders, and those expectations become agreements. And when you have agreements in your school from everyone who has some part of it, things tend to work a little better. And you're always reevaluating that process. So it's ongoing, but it can be done.
Well, I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you so much to our panelists. If you wouldn't mind joining me in showing our appreciation. Thank you so much. I think we're up next with the youth panel.